Thank you very much, Amanda. It's my great pleasure to be back here at the University of Minnesota. I look forward to speaking with you today and taking your questions at about 25 minutes in. So I'll stick to the protocol here. First of all, my funny name, the J, is a nickname, and people really do call me Jay. And my full name is J. Drake Hamilton with Fresh Energy, which is a non-governmental organization that was founded and is still based here in Minnesota. We're actually in downtown St. Paul, Minnesota. But we work throughout the state and the country on federal and state carbon and climate policy, as well as renewable energy, energy efficiency, electricity markets, and another entire program of ours, which is the built environment and transportation. So think of us as policy wonks. We advocate for clean, efficient energy policies that are going to shape and drive realistic but visionary advances in energy policy. A lot of what we do is working in partnership with other people and organizations throughout the state and the country, and communications are a very big part of what we do to advance clean energy policies. Today I'm going to be talking about what's happening with carbon regulation at the national and state level, but I want to begin for spending a few minutes talking about the context, what's new. And every time I give a talk, we find out that there is a lot that's happening just that day usually, and in this case, this week and next week. And I want to remind you of the context under which these regulations are now being drafted by the Environmental Protection Agency. So first, you may have seen in the newspapers today, or heard on radio or TV, that the Supreme Court ruled 6-2 yesterday to overturn a lower court decision about something called the cross-state air pollution rule that the Environmental Protection Agency first promulgated in 2011. And what this means is that something called the good neighbor provision in the cross-state air pollution rule has now been upheld. This is a provision that applies to Minnesota and 27 states to the east of Minnesota. And it is cognizant of the fact that when it comes to nitrogen oxide and sulfur dioxide pollution, what common people tend to call soot and smog pollution, that tends to be very bad for human health, exacerbating everything from asthma attacks to lung disease and causing as many as 34,000 premature deaths in this country every year. That many of those pollutants are coming from power plants that are upwind of the places that are suffering those health damages. So the Minnesota power plants that are going to be covered under this cross-state air pollution rule and will require reduction in those pollutants that form smog and soot are now determined to be harming people in Milwaukee, for instance. And so you can think about any particular pairing of states and consider the health damages that are being incurred at quite a distance. It's a very important landmark, resounding victory for the Environmental Protection Agency, and it paves the way for more action that's going to be happening yet this spring and into this summer. You'll also be well aware that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change this spring, in a series of releases, came out with its 5th assessment report, and one of the strongest pieces of language in that set of reports was that no human on Earth will be unaffected by climate change. And we saw that quoted in many media markets around the country. Second big set of implications of the IPCC's survey of the research that's been done is that the impacts that are happening that were projected at the last release in 2007 are happening for the most part harder and faster than projected in 2007. So we are definitely on a spinning treadmill that seems to be accelerating, particularly since we're in a university setting. And I know many of the people we work with regularly at Fresh Energy who are based here at the university, researchers in many different fields, their very work is going to be impacted by the very fast pace of climate change and the rates of climate change. So everything from the people who are more typically, I think, would work within an institute on the environment setting, people who are interested in climate change itself, people who are interested in energy, wildlife habitat, ecosystems, but also people elsewhere in the university who work on poverty, hunger, sickness, equity issues. All of these problems in and of themselves will be exacerbated if we don't address climate change. Now, I'm going to not, for the most part, be using slides today. I do have a few just ID slides up here. And I encourage people to live tweet from this presentation at Fresh Energy. We do a lot of social media. Just hashtag Fresh Energy, one word. We'd love to be in touch with you that way. But for those people who really find themselves wanting more depth or wanting those slides, I encourage you to sign up for the free webinar we're doing on the historic opportunities that are before Minnesota in the next year on carbon reduction. And that webinar is happening on Wednesday, May 21st. Here's the information, and you can simply sign up for free on our website. That'll be a much more detailed look, and for those aficionados of slides, you will have them in spades. I want to start by talking about a little bit more about my background. Amanda gave you the bio, but part of for the most part, my work is at the state legislature, at the state regulatory body on energy, which is called the Public Utilities Commission, and a little bit with the Environmental Protection Agency itself. But I think maybe because I have more of an academic background and I like to give presentations, I find myself out and about quite a bit. And in the last 5 to 10 years, I think our total audience size, mostly around Minnesota, but typically in audiences of 100 or more, business audiences, the more mainstream we can get, the better, has been over 50,000 people. And one thing I notice as I'm talking to people around Minnesota and this region is that some of the advances that we have made in fighting climate change are really unknown to the general public. And part of what our work is at Fresh Energy is to make sure people know the policies that drove those changes and those economic investments and helped create markets for clean energy that are going to benefit all of us going forward. So there's a very basic level of knowledge that we work on as well. As we go into this new world and some of the adventures of this new world of carbon regulation that has not happened before, everyone will need more of a working knowledge of what has already happened and what is possible. But we'll need more people talking about these issues to policymakers, to opinion leaders, and to their colleagues. We will need much more engagement in order to be successful. Now, I've purposely chose my, oops, now I've gone off slide just a moment. Okay, if you bring me back to the title slide, this one here, that'd be great. Thank you. Why did I choose these words? Adventures on the Frontier of Carbon Regulation. First of all, we're in a Frontiers on the Environment series, but I thought that they pertained really well to what this country and the state are about to embark on when it comes to carbon regulations. First off, if you think about the Merriam-Webster definition of frontiers, and I know we have at least one Canadian in the audience today who introduced himself earlier, I like the one example that Merriam-Webster pulled up, the border between the United States and Canada. That is not on the face of it what this talk is about today, but I like that Merriam-Webster chose that. Some of the definitions include the limits of knowledge in a particular field, certainly that pertains here to carbon regulations, a region that forms the margin of settled territory, and because there are many aspects of climate change that are settled, there are many others that are not, and there are most elements of carbon regulation that have not where there has been no settlement of any kind. Third definition I pulled up is a line of division between different or opposed things, which some people would immediately turn to as, of course, when you're trying to regulate carbon emissions from power plants, and you've never done that before, you can expect that division. But I pulled that one out in particular because at Fresh Energy and with many of the partners we work with, we don't think about people as opponents on an issue. We think there is a great deal in the way of shared core values and shared worldviews. There are certainly divergences in worldviews, but I think that's what makes life interesting. And I think that means that we may need more people coming to the table as stakeholders to talk about how Minnesota is going to move forward on implementing carbon reductions, because we will get a better outcome. And the fourth definition is a little more edgy. A new field for exploitative or developmental activity. We will hope that the carbon regulations that this country adopts and the way that Minnesota makes them and shapes them to Minnesota's realities will not be exploitative, but instead will develop whole new industries and new ways of bringing clean energy to the economy of Minnesota. And then to the word of adventure. An unusual and exciting, typically hazardous experience or activity. An unusual or exciting, typically hazardous experience or activity. Now, I've been doing this work for about 15 years and talking about climate change every day to audiences. I know people talk about, perhaps some other people stopped talking about climate change or global warming. We never did at Fresh Energy. We know that it's a reality and it drives everything we do on energy policy. I've never felt myself in a hazardous situation, but I do think that very much we are on the cutting edge with the work that we're about to embark, all of us. What is about to happen is that the Environmental Protection Agency, which has already issued draft regulations for new power plants that would limit the amount of carbon dioxide that a power plant can put into our atmosphere, and is about to finalize those probably by the end of 2014, on June 2nd or thereabouts of this year, will issue the first ever limits on carbon pollution from existing power plants. So we know that through the Clean Air Act, which was first passed, I believe it was signed on December 31st of the first year that we had Earth Day, 1970, by Richard Nixon. Since that time, we have used the Clean Air Act in this country to protect human health and welfare, which is the basis of that act, and to limit the emissions of lead, cyanide, arsenic, mercury, and sulfur, among other constituents that are emitted from power plants. But currently, there are no limits whatsoever nationwide on carbon dioxide pollution from those same power plants. That will change, and after the draft regulations are laid out and published in the Federal Register in June of this year, there'll be about a year for comment, and then the Environmental Protection Agency is expected to finalize those regulations in about June of 2015. And then each state has an option. There will be a federal implementation plan, so if a state decides not to create a plan for how they are going to achieve the emissions reductions that are specified in those regulations within their borders, the federal government will come in and do that for the state. And some states will choose voluntarily a federal implementation plan, but many states will not. They'll go forward and design a plan that will work best for their current electricity mix, their mix of industries in the state, and what resources they have before them. States will have until June of 2016 or so to do that. So it's a multi-year process. It's been in the works for a long time. In fact, many people have noted that for the last several years, since President Obama in one of the international United Nations negotiations committed our country to take from the 2005 baseline levels for the entire United States and achieve at least a 17% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2020 and at least an 83% reduction by 2050. That smart states should have already been working on their state implementation plan. That in this country, we don't typically do something as big as carbon regulation simply with federal action, but really it's the leadership states that you might expect, as you've seen with other environmental pollutants, that take action first. In crafting those state implementation plans, states will typically work with stakeholders. I know the state of Minnesota has already kicked off the process, and that's very important because two key sets of regulators will have to work together really closely in a way that they haven't in the past. And these are the people who regulate utilities, so the energy regulators in Minnesota. That includes the Department of Commerce and the Public Utilities Commission, and the agency that regulates air quality, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And they have started convening, actually as of about 8 months ago, a large group of stakeholders, including Fresh Energy and all of the utilities, and the Chamber of Commerce and many other players, to talk about what kind of recommendations we would make, and we have made formally to the Environmental Protection Agency as they are thinking about and crafting those draft regulations. We're interested in continuing with that range of voices. I know Fresh Energy is very interested that Minnesota in this process of meeting carbon regulations goes deeper and faster in reducing carbon dioxide pollution than under business as usual. And I'll talk about what we already have in policy in Minnesota that is already driving utility reductions. And we have a very strong base in Minnesota and many other states in that in determining our mix of electricity, we use least cost principles. And there have been very recent examples in Minnesota of how, based on just economics, wind power, solar energy have come out ahead of all other competitors. And in addition, Minnesota utilities or regulators or a combination of thereof have found ways that we can retire and replace, so far, 10 coal-burning units in Minnesota. And those retirements and replacements are happening in every region of the state of Minnesota. So some of it is already happening because of good energy policy that is driving down carbon emissions, and we need to move faster and further there. For this type of regulation, it will be different than some of the other regulations that you may have studied or be familiar with. These carbon reductions, we don't know what the depth of them will look like. It may be something like 25 or 30% reductions by 2020. We hope it's even greater than that because we think the climate science merits deeper action than that. We won't know until June 2nd or so. But we do know that these carbon reductions will not be achieved by generating companies putting scrubbers on existing power plants. So it will be different than the way we have achieved emissions reductions for other pollutants. Instead, it will be achieved by power customers paying for a cleaner mix of power. And the cleaner mix of power will almost certainly include the bedrocks that Minnesota has built its environmental policy and energy policy on, including standards for renewable energy, standards for every natural gas and electric utility for energy efficiency improvements every year. Probably will include more natural gas. Certainly will include a mix of more transmission lines and a greater reliance on our Midwestern grid system and the people who operate that grid system to make sure that we're able to deploy the lowest carbon plants first. And it certainly, we think, will include much less coal. So it's a big transition that we're talking about here. Now, I said very specifically, will be accomplished by power customers paying for a cleaner mix. That statement, though, does not say that they would necessarily need to pay more for a cleaner mix going forward. It depends how this shift is accomplished, and we want it to be, and I think everyone who has weighed in with regulators at the Environmental Protection Agency, and we've looked at most of their comments. Many states, including Minnesota, for example, have already commented to the Environmental Protection Agency that we need to make this as low in cost as possible. Now, Minnesota has some good recent examples of how when you look at the full cost of electricity generation and you go out on the open market for bids, what you are finding, even in a cold weather state like Minnesota, is that very often the cleaner forms of energy that are very low in carbon are out competing the high carbon fossil fuels. 3 examples of that. First, starting last summer, Xcel Energy, our largest electric utility, asked the permission of regulators to go out and essentially do an RFP. They wanted to assess whether on top of the state's existing renewable energy standard, which they are meeting, and which for them will require that they get to 30% renewable electricity by the year 2020. They're on track to meet that standard. But they are aware that the costs of wind are going down, that there are certain investment tax credits that are likely to expire within a couple of years, and they wanted to assess the marketplace of whether they should go above and beyond and whether that would be in customers' best economic interest. The PUC only looks at 2 things: the cost to ratepayers, which we know of as customers, ratepayers they call them, and whether a company is meeting the applicable environmental and energy standards of that state and of the country. Now, when Xcel came to the PUC, they wanted to look at a modest amount of wind power, 250 megawatts. They went out and did bids. We do not know, we at Fresh Energy do not know and are not privy to what those prices are, but we know that they were so low that the PUC came back to, took another bid request from Xcel Energy, which was to say, we would like to purchase 750 megawatts, not 250 megawatts of wind, within the next couple of years which would increase the amount of wind in Excel's system by over 20% because it's lower cost than anything else, including natural gas. And you may have heard that the price of natural gas is at historic lows, or has been in the last couple of years. And the PUC approved that, hands down. Very easy approval, and that's good for all of us. Wind is cheaper than natural gas and another lump of coal in the Sherco power plant. This was big news. Even bigger news when the PUC, within the last couple of weeks, approved a project for moving forward by a company that's based in Edina, Minnesota called Geronimo Energy, which would build in the next 2 years over 20 large solar installations, solar electric installations, to meet peak demand in Xcel Energy's territory in probably 20 different communities from Pipestone, Minnesota to Scandia, Minnesota. So mostly in the southern half of Minnesota. Large installations, primarily on pasture land, which is lower in value than farmland, for willing communities who want those to raise those tax dollars, because the solar energy on peak was cheaper than anything else. So based solely on economics, and that's of course not the only consideration. We have climate considerations, we have environmental considerations, we have consideration of a very stark fact that has driven a lot of Minnesota energy policy. And that very fact is that Minnesota does not have the fossil and uranium fuels that we use so much of. And our price tag in the last couple of years per year to import those fuels or electricity from those conventional fuels has been about $13 billion a year, which is right around the total budget of the state of Minnesota. So we can think surely of much better ways to invest that money, and that has helped drive policies that have moved Minnesota to a greater mix of homegrown electricity, much of which is much cleaner than the traditional grid going forward. So on cost alone, those renewables are outcompeting the competition. And then finally, as the state develops a state implementation plan with lots of stakeholder input, it will, by necessity and of course, and with good reason, build it on existing policies and ramping up those existing policies that have allowed us to begin retiring and replacing those 10 coal units, that have allowed us to move in Minnesota to the situation we have now, where we have a renewable electricity standard on all utilities. There are over 100 utilities in Minnesota. Every utility is meeting that standard ahead of time and at lower cost than expected. Many utilities are actually finding that it is the very cheapest thing they can do. And our largest utility, Xcel, is among those and has been very outspoken about that. It's the cheapest thing that they can do to provide more renewables for their mix going forward. And that combination of policies going forward has meant that since those policies were passed in 2007, in the ensuing 6.5 years, we have cut carbon pollution or avoided about 40 metric tons of carbon dioxide in Minnesota. So we have demonstrations aplenty in Minnesota that energy efficiency and renewable energy can help us begin to replace our reliance on coal and replace it with a broader mix, more diverse mix of cleaner, low carbon or zero carbon technologies going forward at very low cost. Some of the work that the state of Minnesota is investigating based on direction from the bipartisan legislature last year is that the state of Minnesota will complete in November, have a study looking at what it would take to take our existing renewable energy standard, which is now set statewide at, it's called the 25 by 25 law. So it requires that utilities get 25% of their electricity from new renewables by the year 2025. But the year 2025 is coming up quickly, and the legislature acknowledged that last year. And so the study will look at going out to the year 2030 and expanding that standard to 40% renewables. It will also take a look and do an analysis of a 50% renewable electricity standard by 2030. So looking at moving that forward more quickly. And they will be interested in reliability, grid implications, cost to make that work, and the benefits in terms of carbon dioxide reduction. So we'll have more information as of November for the legislature to mull over. So exciting things are happening. The final thing I'll tell you about is not directly related to carbon regulation, but something you may also have seen in the media in the last 6 to 8 months because the study that it's grounded in was done here at the university by Dr. Steve Pulaski. And it is a study that Fresh Energy and our partners submitted to the Minnesota PUC in asking those regulators to update the externalities values that the state of Minnesota, which has been required since 1993, to consider when they're looking at major investments that they would approve or deny for large power plants. What are those externality health and environmental costs? So they are not regulatory values. They are not applied. You won't see a price tag on your bill. But the idea is to be smarter in planning for the electricity future and to not make more dumb mistakes and bad, very expensive investments in old power plants that someday will be required to pay the price for the health and environmental problems that they cause. So Minnesota is unique, I believe, in having that instrument in legislation. And the PUC voted unanimously to require that Minnesota update those values. They haven't been updated since the mid to late 1990s. Some of you in the room have been responsible for increasing the database of knowledge of climate impacts and health impacts from power plants, as have other researchers around the country and the world. And so we have a vast amount of information that we did not have in 1993 or 1997 about those health and environmental impacts of power plants. Within about a year, we expect to have new values that regulators in Minnesota will use. And the way they'll use them is this. When an investor-owned utility comes before them and asks for permission to spend what could be hundreds of millions of dollars to upgrade a coal plant, they'll be required to do analyses using those externalities values about what else we're getting as a community besides more power from conventional energy. And the difference between those old values that we're currently using and the updated values is likely more than $1.5 billion a year in terms of especially of health impacts. So we do think that this will level the playing field as regulators look at how to make a transition from these power plants that in some cases are 30, 40, and 50 years old now, and obviously will be 20 years older in 20 years, and how soon and how and exactly how we make a transition to cleaner sources of energy that replace those units of power. President Obama's EPA is driving a lot of this work. You may have heard President Obama's speech at Georgetown University in June of last year, where he said that we need to stop the limitless dumping of carbon dioxide into our shared atmosphere. And it was a politician's speech, so he made a rousing call that we have an obligation to ourselves, our kids, and future generations to take responsibility and stop this ridiculous limitless dumping. It's very much like you were simply dumping your waste can over a fence into your neighbor's yard with no repercussions from that, but obviously on a much more massive scale with many more implications than that. So we are about to go into uncharted waters, this new frontier. There will be lots of adventures along the way. I'm absolutely certain that we will not be successful in Minnesota or the nation unless more well-educated, concerned people are able to weigh in with us at Fresh Energy or other partners going forward. We will need a lot more public concern to move forward on these carbon standards. It will be one of the most challenging things we have done in terms of environmental regulation in this country. But I think what will drive it forward is experience of states like Minnesota that have already shown that we can get significant carbon reductions by moving to clean energy and help build a marketplace that has put us in a position where in several circumstances now, in just the last six months, we have found the cheapest thing to do is to move as expeditiously as possible to zero carbon energy. President Obama said in that speech, and he said it in several speeches since, something that sounds a lot like what we've said at Fresh Energy, but I think he's left off one key thing that I'm going to tell you about, that we've always added. We've said, when you look around at your future kids and grandkids, and you think about what we knew about climate change and its impacts, and what the world scientists were saying we needed to do right away, and those future kids and grandkids ask you what you did back in 2014, we need to tell them we did everything we could to fight climate change. And Fresh Energy goes on from there. We need to tell them we did everything we could to fight climate change, and it worked. Thank you very much.